Hi, my name is Carlos Solorzano, and I'm very privileged to be part of the Holy Spirit Summit. A little background on myself. I am a theology teacher at St. Augustine Catholic High School. I'm currently finishing up my 28th year of teaching, which has flown by. I'm also part of the Catholic Speakers Organization, as I've done talks over the years at parishes, schools, Catholic events, conferences, both in person and online. And anywhere I'm needed, wherever God sends me to speak, it's always a privilege, and it's always great to be around God's people and to both offer lessons I can give them as well as to learn from them as well. So I'm in my classroom right now actually shooting this video where I'm going to talk a little bit about the Holy Spirit, and I'm really excited about this because I feel like Holy Spirit is a topic that we don't talk about enough. And there's so much about it, and it's so much we get to experience in the modern world today. Now, we do know that some other names for the Holy Spirit are both Paraclete and Advocate, with Paraclete meaning someone called upon for help, and Advocate referring to someone who stands by your side. And I think a lot about, say, teachers who are struggling to deliver certain messages, to the martyrs who stood boldly in the face of persecution and death when they were asked to renounce their faith. And it was through the power of the Holy Spirit that they were able to maintain their faith. But the Holy Spirit, of course, has been with us since the beginning. I mean, in the Old Testament, while we do talk about the Word being present with the Father and that being what proclaimed creation, we do hear about the wind over the water, which is an agent of creation, which they identify as the Holy Spirit. You also had the Holy Spirit that was empowering the prophets with their message that they were giving to the people, as well as that presence of God in the Jewish community. When it comes to the New Testament time period, many people talk about the Holy Spirit would be the thing that empowered Jesus with his messianic powers, and of course would be the thing that was with the church from the beginning and continues to be with the church today. Obviously, that leads us to Pentecost, where a lot of times we think about the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And of course, these are things that were predicted as far back as the Old Testament, as the prophet Joel talked about the Spirit being poured out among the people in the future. But Jesus also in the Gospel of John chapter 14 talked about how the Spirit will be with them always and how the Spirit will teach them everything and remind them of all that Jesus taught. Now, this is really important because when we start seeing the work of the Spirit in the early church, when they would see one thing happen and then see it repeated, that was one of those things where they realized it was God's presence and God's will for certain things to happen. So, for example, it's easy to look at Acts of the Apostles chapter 2 and the outpouring of the Spirit at Pentecost. Now, that was foretold again by the prophet Joel, and of course, this was something that the apostles anticipated. What's nice about that, besides the fact that it theologically reverses the Tower of Babel event, is that it really showed the community that God was with them. I mean, as exciting as it must have been to see their faith rewarded by the risen Jesus, which of course gave them great courage, we also cannot forget that the Holy Spirit was there to empower the early church. One of my favorite stories in Acts of the Apostles is when Peter and John are arrested by the Sanhedrin. The key word in that particular event is Sanhedrin, because that would mean the same leaders who arrested Jesus and sent him to Pontius Pilate to have him executed were the same people that arrested Peter and John. So you can imagine it would be normal for them to be afraid because of the fact that they know what they did to Jesus. However, besides seeing the risen Jesus and then experiencing the grace of the Holy Spirit, Peter is able to stand right in front of them and say, we must obey God and not man. We will not, you're ordering us to stop with this preaching. We will not. And there was a great presence in Peter to the point where the great teacher Gamaliel said, look, let's just leave them alone, because if it's from God, we can't stop it. If it's not from God, it'll go away. But the confidence Peter had to show really had to have an effect on them. We've all encountered great holy people who've had that presence in them. It could be anyone from, say, a very loving and Christ-like bishop, to our parish priests who are wonderful shepherds in our lives, or that prayerful grandmother of ours who prays for us every day and that love she shows to us, we could feel that spirit coming out of her. And that spirit is something that all of us are invited to take into our own lives. Speaking of Acts of the Apostles, what's interesting about that, and I always find this interesting with my students, and actually even a lot of adults when I do talks at parishes, a lot of us are not familiar with later Pentecost events where they talk about both the Samaritan Pentecost and the Gentile Pentecost, where in Acts chapter 8, we have Philip going to Samaria. And here he is preaching to Samaritans who are half Jewish and half Assyrian. They're seen kind of like as mixed breeds by the Jewish people. Now, people sometimes forget that when Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan, we're used to the story, and a lot of times people will even mistakenly call a Samaritan a good person. No, a Samaritan's a person from Samaria. And for the Jewish people at the time, they didn't like them very much because they essentially had half of their conqueror in their bloodline. So there was a lot of rivalry and tension between both groups. All of a sudden, you have Philip sharing the gospel with the Samaritan people, and then them accepting it, and then the same spirit that came upon the church at Pentecost is now coming upon the Samaritan people. So this is God working. This is the Spirit working. They're seeing the same activity and the same reaction happening to the Samaritan people that happened in Jerusalem at Pentecost. So as Gamaliel said, we can't fight God. The apostles, even though they may have had some of that cultural prejudice, that cultural uncertainty, or we'll just call it cultural suspicion of the Samaritan people, but now they're seeing the Holy Spirit say, you know what? These people believe, it's genuine, they are worthy, my Spirit now comes upon them. It's beautiful. Later in Acts chapter 10, Peter goes to Caesarea to see Cornelius, who has a vision to summon him. Now we have the same Holy Spirit going upon the Gentiles. You have that episode of the baptism of Cornelius. Whatever's happening among these Gentile people is now genuine. It's a real faith in the Christian gospel. So therefore, the Holy Spirit pours out upon the Gentiles. So these are non-Jews, people who have no Jewish whatever it is in them. Sorry, I can't think of a word right now, but they're not Jewish, and the Spirit pours upon them. God, once again, God is moving. God's activity is saying, this is real. Same Spirit you saw at the first Pentecost is now pouring out on these people. They are worthy. So the church witnesses it. And of course, this leads to the Council of Jerusalem. Now, what's beautiful about that is you have the letter that's written to the churches. It says here in Acts chapter 15, verses 28 to 29, it is the decision of the Holy Spirit first, and of us. Of course, the apostles have authority that's given to them by Jesus, but again, the decision of the Holy Spirit first, and us, not to place on you any burden beyond these necessities, namely to abstain from meat sacrificed to idols, from blood, from meats of strangled animals, and from unlawful marriage. So in other words, there are certain practices, no matter who the people are in the universal church now, because now the church is being poured out to all people. So the burden of the Mosaic law will not be required of all people, but there are certain things that are non-negotiable. Now, obviously, with the Spirit pouring out, especially among the Gentiles who are uncircumcised and do not practice the law, Peter could, and the other leaders of the church could see God is not discriminating. God is not going to look at how well you practice the law or whether or not you're circumcised. God's action says you're worthy. So they obeyed the Spirit even though they had the authority of God to run the church. On top of that, what's also very exciting is the fact that we have a number of examples of the Holy Spirit working in the world outside of Jerusalem. I'd like to read this passage from the Catechism, number 522. It's one of my favorites. The coming of God's Son to earth is an event of such immensity that God willed to prepare for it over centuries. He makes everything converge on Christ. All the rituals and sacrifices, figures and symbols of the first covenant. He announces him through the mouths of the prophets, who succeeded one another in Israel. Moreover, he awakens in the hearts of the pagans a dim expectation of this coming. I love that. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Fulton Sheen, one of our favorite bishops. We knew of messianic prophecies, for example, that were foretold by the prophets Isaiah and Micah in the Old Testament. However, Fulton Sheen had a whole collection of things in an older book called The Coming of Christ, where he talks about Socrates and Plato, for example, speaking of the Logos who would come. And there were other statements by some people such as Tacitus, Suetonius, who talked about everything from the Jewish people having some sort of privilege when it comes to prophetic insights to the coming of some global leader to that area. You even have Confucius, centuries before both Socrates and Plato and Christ, speaking of the saint that would come in the West. So there was this activity, this feeling, this sort of a grumbling in the human spirit that was waiting for the coming of Christ. Now it's interesting because that would also happen after Christ in areas where it wasn't necessarily expected. For example, we're going to have some links put in the description or the comments part of this talk where I'm going to have some blogs I wrote about a couple of people that may be of a surprise to you. The first one actually is a Christian. His name was King Alfonso from the Congo. Now, he was baptized a Christian. This, of course, was after he was, the missionaries came to his country and shared the gospel. But it's interesting because the way this man actually came to Christ and lived as a Christian is very similar to Constantine. So there are people who actually identify him as the African Constantine. However, one incident that's really exciting is there were some figures in pre-Columbian Mexico who lived it's a community across the lake from Tenochtitlan, where the Aztecs were from, called Texcoco. And the names are kind of tricky to pronounce, but the king's name was Nezahualcóyotl, who reasoned that there was one God. He proclaimed himself a monotheist. He openly admitted he did not fully know the God, but he was confident that one day the God would be known in his land. And of course, we can argue that that happened later when Catholicism was brought by the Spaniards. Now, he did travel his kingdom to see the needs of his people in disguise, so there was that sense of charity in his heart. And he had a temple where he would offer flowers and incense to this God he was trying to know, but he was confident that one day his people would know this God. Later, his son Nezahualpili, who was very wise, many compare him to Solomon, continued his father's work and actually warned Montezuma that if he did not stop the practice of human sacrifice, that invaders from across the sea would come and take his kingdom, which actually did happen because Montezuma did not stop practice of human sacrifice. This was not practiced at all in Texcoco. They did not allow that type of behavior to exist. So you could look at these particular events, and since they were searching for the real God, we could see that the Holy Spirit did give them a dim expectation of this coming. Because obviously in the Christian gospel that would be preached there one day, it would not just be the presence of the Holy Spirit, but they would also know God the Father and Jesus Christ the Messiah. So anyway, I hope I was able to offer some insights on the Holy Spirit. These are always very exciting for me to share, but also it was very exciting for me to learn. So if any of you also have some insights of certain things that happen around the world that was not presented in this talk, please by all means share that in the comments. And if you have any resources or links, it would be wonderful for you to also share those so we can all learn from each other. Thank you and God bless you all.